All right, A-Push crew, let's do this. If you're here for that big picture, strategic overview of the entire course to tie everything together before the exam, you are in exactly the right place. We are not going to get lost in the weeds today. Instead, we're going to build a mental map to see the grand sweep of American history. Okay, let's jump in. This right here, this quote basically is the entire course. See, APUSH isn't just a random list of facts and dates. It's a story, and it really has two main plot lines. First, it's about this massive transformation, how we went from scattered settlements to a world superpower. And second, and this is the really important part, it's about a constant argument, an argument over two huge questions. Who gets to be a full member of We the People? And what does freedom actually look like day to day? Every single period we study is just another chapter in that same argument.
And you know what drives that whole story? It really boils down to these three recurring tensions. Think of these as the engine of American history. You've got the constant tug of war between the federal government in D.C. and the power of states and local towns. You have the struggle between our founding ideal of equality and the often harsh reality of social and racial hierarchies. And finally, that constant American impulse to expand, whether it's territory or influence or rights, versus the forces that are always trying to put limits on that growth. I promise you, you will see these three fights pop up over and over again.
So, here's our game plan for today. We just covered the main idea, our American story thesis. Next, we're going to break the course into three big mega eras to see the major shifts. Then we'll connect the big themes that run through the whole story. And finally, we'll wrap up with how to use all this as a strategy for your exam. Let's get to it. Okay, our first mega era. This covers periods 1, 2, and 3. The big story here is this incredible shift from a continent dominated by hundreds of diverse native societies to a string of colonies ruled by a distant empire, and then, bam, the creation of a brand new independent republic. A republic that was born with these radical ideas about liberty, but also with some deep, deep contradictions baked right into its foundation from day one. This timeline just lays out that journey perfectly. You start in 1491, a world before European contact. Then, 1607, Jamestown is founded. That's the pivotal moment. For the next century and a half, the colonies just kind of grow and do their own thing. But the real turning point is 1754. The French and Indian War changes everything. It leads straight to the revolutionary ideas of 1776, the new government in 1787, and then the election of 1800. And that moment was huge. It was proof that this new republic could survive a bitter political fight without completely falling apart.
Now, to really get why the revolution happened, you have to understand this phrase, salutary neglect. For about 150 years, Britain pretty much left the colonies alone to run their own affairs. So you've got this weird situation where the colonists felt totally English, but they were also getting really used to governing themselves, with things like the Virginia House of Burgesses and New England town meetings. So when the French and Indian War ended and Britain suddenly started tightening its grip and demanding new taxes, the colonists were outraged. They felt their rights as Englishmen were being trampled. The end of salutary neglect is what lit the fuse of the revolution. And this brings us to the massive, unresolved contradiction of this whole era. In order to get all the states to agree and create the United States, the founders had to make some dirty deals. They literally wrote slavery into the Constitution with things like the Three-Fifths Compromise. This decision was a political time bomb, just ticking away at the heart of the new nation. It basically kicked the can down the road, guaranteeing that the country's ideals of liberty would one day have a violent collision with the reality of slavery. All right, on to our second mega era, which covers periods 4 all the way through 7. This is where that small, farm-based republic of 1800 completely transforms into a sprawling, continent-spanning industrial giant. This era is all about massive, explosive change in the economy, in the size of the country, and in the power of the government itself. The best way to tackle this huge chunk of history is to think of it as 3 giant transformations happening all at once. First, you've got the market and industrial revolutions, which just totally rewire the American economy with canals, railroads, and factories. Second, you have this idea of manifest destiny driving the country west, but every new piece of land sparks another fight over slavery, which leads directly to the Civil War. And third, a whole series of crises, from the Gilded Age to the Great Depression and 2 world wars, radically expands the power of the federal government.
And this right here is probably the single most important pattern from Era 2. Remember this, every major crisis expands federal power. The Civil War proves the federal union is supreme, the Progressive Era sees the government stepping in to regulate big business for the first time, and of course, the New Deal during the Great Depression creates a federal safety net, which fundamentally changes the relationship between Americans and their government forever. This pattern is a huge theme on the exam. And that brings us to our third and final era, covering periods 8 and 9, basically from the end of World War II to today. In 1945, the U.S. walks out of the war as without a doubt the most powerful economic and military force on the planet. This period is all about America's new role as a global superpower, the massive social upheavals happening at home, and the new challenges of a digital, globalized world. For the first half of this era, American foreign policy was totally driven by one single word: containment. The whole idea was that the U.S. had to stop the spread of Soviet communism anywhere and everywhere it popped up. This one doctrine explains pretty much everything: why the U.S. fought wars in Korea and Vietnam, why we formed alliances like NATO, and why we built up a massive military. For almost 50 years, this was the lens through which America saw the entire world. But here's the thing you can't forget about this era. There were two completely different stories happening at the same time. While America was fighting the Cold War and projecting all this power across the globe, a profound revolution was happening right here at home. The civil rights movement, the women's movement, the environmental movement, they were all fundamentally challenging what it meant to be an American. They were redefining our national identity and forcing the country to finally start living up to its own founding ideals. Okay, so we've broken the course into our three big eras. Now it's time to do what the AP exam really wants you to do, which is to connect the dots. We're going to trace the big themes across the entire timeline. This is where you go from just knowing stuff to actually thinking like a historian. Let's trace one of our key tensions: federal power. This is a perfect example of change over time. You see, it starts out super weak with the Articles of Confederation. It gets stronger with the Constitution, but right away, states start pushing back. The Civil War settles the question. Federal power is supreme. Then, the New Deal makes it dominant in American life. And ever since the 1980s, we've been in this new era of debating and fighting over just how big that power should be. See, it's not a straight line, it's a constant tug of war. So what about that other big question? Who gets to be an American? This comparison is just, wow, it's so striking. In 1790, if you wanted to be a full political citizen, you pretty much had to be a white Protestant guy who owned land. That was it. Fast forward to today, and through centuries of struggle, through constitutional amendments, social movements, and immigration, that definition has expanded in ways the founders never could have imagined. This might be the single biggest story of change in all of American history, the slow, painful, and ongoing expansion of the circle of we the people. So let's bring it all home. How do you actually use all this big picture thinking to crush your exam? This last part is all about strategy. It's about taking this framework and putting it to work for you. This is the most important question you can ask, seriously. And the answer is not, can you memorize a million names and dates? That is not the game. The AP exam is designed to test something much, much deeper. This is what the exam is actually testing. It's testing these skills. Can you recognize a pattern, like how crises tend to expand federal power? Can you compare two different time periods, like the Gilded Age in the 1920s? Can you explain what changed over time, but also what stayed the same? Can you explain why something happened, not just that it happened? And can you connect a long-term trend, like the definition of citizenship, across hundreds of years? This is what they're looking for. So if you remember one mental model for U.S. political history, make it this one. This cycle repeats itself over and over. First, a major crisis hits, like the Great Depression. That crisis leads to a massive expansion of federal power, like the New Deal. That expansion then creates a backlash from people who think the government has gone way too far. And that backlash eventually leads to a political realignment, like the rise of the conservative movement that elected Ronald Reagan. You can apply this cycle to so many moments in American history. And that brings us to our final thought. The story isn't over. You are living in it right now. So using the historical thinking skills we just talked about, what patterns are shaping America's story today? Which of those recurring tensions do you see playing out on the news every night? That's the real power of studying history. It gives you the tools to understand your own world. You've got this. Good luck.